Homeless man finds injured millionaire with a suitcase full of money. Days later, he looks for him, but didn't know that. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video, give it a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, comment and share. The rain poured relentlessly over Portland's dimly lit streets, casting an eerie glow on the glistening pavement. Jack Reynolds huddled beneath a flimsy cardboard shelter, his weathered hands clutching a tattered blanket around his shoulders. At 34, life had dealt him a series of cruel blows, leaving him homeless and struggling to survive on the unforgiving streets of Oregon's largest city. As the night deepened, Jack's ears perked up at the sound of labored breathing and uneven footsteps. Peering out from his makeshift refuge, he spotted a figure stumbling through the downpour, clutching something tightly to his chest. The man's expensive suit was soaked through, his silver hair plastered to his forehead. Curiosity overcame caution, and Jack emerged from his shelter. "Hey, mister, you okay?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. The stranger's head snapped up, revealing a face etched with pain and fear. "Help," he gasped before collapsing face first onto the sidewalk. A sleek black briefcase skittered across the wet concrete, coming to rest at Jack's feet. Jack's heart raced as he knelt beside the unconscious man. Years on the street had taught him to be wary, but something about this situation felt different. He reached for the briefcase, his fingers trembling as he flipped the latches. The contents made his eyes widen in disbelief. Stacks of crisp $100 bills filled the case, more money than Jack had ever seen in his life. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what he could do with such a fortune. A warm bed, hot meals, maybe even a fresh start. But as he looked at the unconscious man's face, a pang of conscience struck him. This guy needed help, and Jack couldn't bring himself to abandon him, no matter how tempting the money was. With a heavy sigh, Jack snapped the briefcase shut and tucked it safely beneath his cardboard shelter. Then he fumbled in his pocket for the battered flip phone he'd managed to keep charged at the local shelter. His fingers shook as he dialed 911, torn between his moral duty and the promise of a better life just within reach. As sirens wailed in the distance, Jack made a split-second decision. He couldn't risk being found with the briefcase when the paramedics arrived. Grabbing the case, he sprinted down the alley, his heart pounding in his ears. He stashed it behind a dumpster 2 blocks away, memorizing every detail of its location. Returning to the scene, Jack found the paramedics already, tending to the unconscious man. A young EMT with kind eyes approached him. "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" Jack swallowed hard, fighting the urge to glance in the direction of the hidden briefcase. I found him like this. He just collapsed. Is he going to be okay?" The EMT nodded reassuringly. "We're doing everything we can. Thank you for calling us. Can I get your name for the report?" "Jack," he replied, then hesitated before adding, "Jack Reynolds." As the ambulance pulled away, its lights cutting through the rain-soaked night, Jack felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He'd done the right thing, hadn't he? But now, with that briefcase hidden away, he faced a decision that could change his life forever. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the turbulent night before. Jack made his way to the local community center, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous evening. As he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of coffee and disinfectant greeted him. "Jack, good to see you," called out Sophia Martinez, the center's dedicated social worker. At 30, Sophia had a warmth about her that put even the most troubled souls at ease. "You're looking a bit more ragged than usual. Rough night?" If only she knew, Jack thought. "You could say that," he mumbled, accepting the steaming cup of coffee she offered. "Hey, Sophia, can I ask you something hypothetical?" Sophia's eyebrow arched with curiosity. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Jack took a deep breath. "Let's say someone found a lot of money, like life-changing money, but it belonged to someone else who might be in trouble. What should they do?" Sophia studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "Well, legally speaking, they should turn it in to the police. But I'm guessing this someone is in a tough spot themselves?" Jack nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Then I'd say they need to follow their conscience," Sophia said softly. Sometimes life presents us with difficult choices. The right path isn't always clear, but it's the one that lets you sleep at night. Her words resonated with Jack, stirring something deep within him. He'd spent years surviving, but at what cost to his soul? Maybe it was time to start living again, to be the man he'd once hoped to become. With newfound resolve, Jack finished his coffee and headed out. He had a decision to make, and for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. As Jack approached the alley where he'd hidden the briefcase, his heart pounded in his chest. What if someone had found it? What if the man from last night came looking for it? 1,000 scenarios raced through his mind, each more anxiety-inducing than the last. To his immense relief, the briefcase was exactly where he'd left it, untouched, behind the dumpster. Jack's hands trembled as he retrieved it, the weight of its contents feeling even heavier in the light of day. He found a secluded spot in a nearby park and opened the case, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of all that money. But as he rifled through the stacks of bills, something else caught his eye, a folder tucked neatly at the bottom. Curiosity overtook caution, and Jack opened the folder. Inside were documents filled with numbers, ledgers, and names he didn't recognize. One name, however, stood out: Richard Hartley, CEO of Hartley Construction. Jack's mind raced. The man he'd helped last night, could he be Richard Hartley? And if so, what were these documents and why did they seem so important? As he pondered his next move, a job listing in the local paper caught his eye. Hartley Construction was hiring laborers for a new project downtown. It seemed like too much of a coincidence to ignore. With a mix of determination and trepidation, Jack made his way to the construction site. The foreman, a burly man named Mike, eyed him skeptically. "You ever worked construction before?" Mike asked gruffly. Jack squared his shoulders. "I'm a quick learner and not afraid of hard work. Give me a chance and I won't let you down." Maybe it was the desperation in Jack's voice, or perhaps Mike saw something in his eyes that spoke of untapped potential. Whatever the reason, he nodded. "All right, Reynolds, you start tomorrow, 6 a.m. sharp, don't be late." As Jack walked away, his heart lighter than it had been in years, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. Little did he know, the real challenges and surprises were just beginning. Over the next few weeks, Jack threw himself into his new job with a fervor that surprised even himself. The physical labor was grueling, but it felt good to be productive, to be part of something. His co-workers, initially wary of the newcomer, gradually warmed to his quiet determination and willingness to learn. But even as Jack's external circumstances improved, the weight of his secret gnawed at him. The briefcase, now hidden in a rented storage unit, was never far from his thoughts. He'd used a small amount of the money to secure a room at a boarding house and buy some decent clothes, but the bulk of it remained untouched, a ticking time bomb of moral uncertainty. One sweltering afternoon, as Jack was hauling lumber across the site, a sleek black car pulled up. The site fell quiet as a distinguished-looking man stepped out, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate despite the summer heat. Jack's heart nearly stopped. It was him, the man from that rainy night, looking none the worse for wear. Richard Hartley had come to inspect the progress on his latest project. As Hartley made his way through the site, shaking hands and examining blueprints, Jack tried to make himself inconspicuous. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. "You there," Hartley called out, pointing directly at Jack. "Bring that lumber over." "Here, would you?" Jack's palms were sweating as he approached, certain that at any moment Hartley would recognize him and demand answers about the missing briefcase. But as he set down the lumber and straightened up, he saw no flash of recognition in the older man's eyes. Instead, Hartley smiled warmly. "Good work, son. What's your name?" "Jack Reynolds, sir," he managed to reply, his voice steadier than he felt. Hartley's eyebrows rose slightly. "Reynolds, eh? Any relation to the Reynolds construction family?" Jack shook his head. "No, sir, just a coincidence, I guess." "Well, Jack," Hartley said, clapping him on the shoulder, "keep up the good work. We need more young men like you in this business." As Hartley moved on, Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The encounter left him shaken, but also strangely energized. He'd been face to face with the man whose money he held, and nothing had happened. Was this a sign? A chance to start fresh without the burden of his secret? But just as Jack was beginning to feel a glimmer of hope, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Thomas Green, the project manager, was watching him with a calculating look in his eyes. There was something in that gaze that spoke of suspicion, of hidden agendas. Jack turned away quickly, busying himself with his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The simple act of helping a stranger on a rainy night had set in motion a chain of events that threatened to upend not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the construction site, Jack couldn't help but wonder, in trying to do the right thing, had he inadvertently stumbled into a web of deceit and corruption that went far beyond a briefcase full of cash. With each passing day, the weight of his secret grew heavier, and Jack found himself caught between the life he was building and the truth he was hiding. Little did he know, the real test of his character and his courage was yet to come. As the weeks turned into months, Jack found himself settling into a routine that felt both comforting and surreal. His work at the construction site had become a source of pride, a tangible reminder of how far he'd come from those desperate nights on the streets. Yet the briefcase hidden in the storage unit remained a constant shadow, a reminder of the fragile nature of his new life. One crisp autumn morning, Jack arrived at the site to find an unusual buzz of activity. Whispers and furtive glances followed him as he made his way to his workstation. "Hey, Jack," called out Dave, one of the friendlier laborers. "Did you hear? The big boss is coming down today. Word is he's looking to promote someone to the supervisor position." Jack's stomach tightened. Another visit from Richard Hartley meant another chance for recognition, another risk to his carefully constructed facade. But before he could dwell on it, a commotion near the site office caught everyone's attention. Thomas Green, the project manager, stormed out, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He barked orders at the foreman, his eyes darting suspiciously around the site as if searching for an unseen enemy. As Jack watched, he couldn't shake the feeling that Green's agitation was somehow connected to the documents he'd found in the briefcase. The nagging sense that he was caught in the middle of something much larger than himself grew stronger. Just then, a familiar black car pulled up, and Richard Hartley stepped out. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A woman accompanied him, her elegant posture and scrutinizing gaze marking her as someone of importance. "That's Evelyn Hartley," Dave whispered. "The boss's wife. They say she's got a nose for trouble and the brains to match." Jack nodded, trying to appear casual as the Hartleys made their way through the site. He couldn't help but notice the way Evelyn's eyes seemed to take in every detail, lingering on faces and interactions with an almost unnerving intensity. As fate would have it, the couple's path brought them directly to where Jack was working. Richard's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, Jack Reynolds," he exclaimed, extending his hand. "I remember you from my last visit. How are you finding the work?" Jack shook his hand, acutely aware of Evelyn's appraising gaze. "It's been great, Mr. Hartley. I'm grateful for the opportunity." "Glad to hear it," Richard replied warmly. "You know, we've been impressed with your progress. In fact, I was thinking—" But before he could finish, Thomas Green appeared, smoothly inserting himself into the conversation. "Mr. Hartley, if I could have a moment of your time. There's an urgent matter we need to discuss." As Richard excused himself, Jack couldn't help but notice the look that passed between Evelyn and Green, a mixture of suspicion and something that looked almost like a challenge. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity and speculation. Jack tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting to the hidden briefcase and the growing sense that he was standing on the edge of something he didn't fully understand. That evening, as Jack walked home, lost in thought, he almost collided with someone rounding the corner. "Oh, I'm so sorry," a familiar voice exclaimed. Jack looked up to find himself face to face with Sophia Martinez, the social worker from the community center. "Sophia, what are you doing in this part of town?" Jack asked, surprised to see her so far from the center. Sophia smiled, though Jack noticed a hint of worry in her eyes. "Actually, I was hoping to run into you. Do you have a minute to talk?" They found a quiet bench in a nearby park, the autumn leaves creating a colourful canopy above them. Sophia turned to Jack, her expression serious. "Jack, I don't want to pry, but I'm concerned. There have been some strange inquiries about you at the centre. Men in suits asking questions about your background, your habits. It's not like the usual reference checks we sometimes get." Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. "What kind of questions?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They wanted to know about your finances, whether you'd come into any money recently. Jack, if you're in some kind of trouble." He shook his head quickly. "It's not what you think, Sophia. I can't explain everything right now, but I promise I haven't done anything wrong." Sophia studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I believe you, Jack, but whatever's going on, please be careful. And remember, if you need help, I'm here." As they parted ways, Jack's mind was racing. The walls were closing in, and he knew he needed to make a decision soon. But with so many unknowns, every choice seemed fraught with danger. The next day at the construction site, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every conversation, every glance seemed loaded with hidden meaning. He was so distracted that he nearly missed the commotion near the site office. Richard Hartley had returned, this time without Evelyn. He was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Thomas Green. Though Jack couldn't make out the words, the tension was palpable. Suddenly, Richard turned and strode purposefully across the site, heading directly for Jack. The other workers quickly found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving Jack feeling exposed and vulnerable. "Jack," Richard said, his voice low and urgent, "I need to speak with you privately. Can you meet me at this address tonight?" He pressed a small card into Jack's hand. Before Jack could respond, Richard was gone, leaving him staring at the card in confusion and growing alarm. The address was for a small diner on the outskirts of town, neutral ground for a conversation that Jack sensed would change everything. As the day wore on, Jack's anxiety grew. He considered not showing up, considered coming clean about the briefcase, considered a dozen different scenarios, but in the end, he knew he had to face whatever was coming. That evening, as Jack approached the diner, he saw Richard Hartley already seated in a booth near the back. The older man looked tired, the weight of unseen burdens evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Thank you for coming, Jack," Richard said, as Jack slid into the seat across from him. "I imagine you're wondering what this is all about." Jack nodded, his throat too dry for words. Richard leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know about the briefcase, Jack. I know you were the one who helped me that night and called the ambulance. What I need to know is, did you look at the documents inside?" The moment of truth had arrived. Jack took a deep breath, meeting Richard's gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I did." Instead of anger, relief washed over Richard's face. "Good. Because I need your help, Jack. Those documents, they're evidence of a massive fraud scheme within my company. A scheme that I fear goes much deeper than I initially thought." As Richard began to explain the intricate web of deceit and corruption he'd uncovered, Jack felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The simple act of helping a stranger on a rainy night had led him to this moment, poised on the precipice of a dangerous but potentially world-changing endeavor. "I know I'm asking a lot," Richard concluded, "but I believe you're a man of integrity, Jack. Will you help me expose the truth and save my company?" Jack sat in stunned silence, the weight of the decision before him almost overwhelming. He thought of his life on the streets, of the chance Richard had unknowingly given him, of Sophia's concern, and of the man he wanted to be. Finally, he met Richard's gaze, his decision made. "I'm in, Mr. Hartley. Whatever it takes, I'll help you uncover the truth." As they shook hands across the table, sealing their unlikely alliance, Jack couldn't help but wonder what challenges and dangers lay ahead. He'd taken the first step on a path that would test his courage, his loyalty, and his newfound sense of purpose. Little did he know, the real battle was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The following weeks were a delicate balancing act for Jack. By day, he continued his work at the construction site, trying to maintain an air of normalcy while keenly aware of Thomas Green's increasingly suspicious glances. By night, he met with Richard Hartley in secret, poring over documents and piecing together the extent of the fraud that had infiltrated Hartley Construction. As they worked, Jack found himself growing to respect and even like the older man. Richard was not the cold corporate tycoon Jack had initially imagined, but a passionate builder who had started his company from scratch, driven by a genuine desire to create and improve his community. "You know, Jack," Richard said one evening as they sat surrounded by stacks of financial records, "in many ways you remind me of myself when I was younger, that same hunger to prove yourself, to make something of your life." Jack felt a pang of guilt at the praise, knowing there was still so much about himself he hadn't shared. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," he mumbled. Richard nodded, a wistful look in his eyes. "That's becoming a rare quality these days. It's why I'm glad you're here. I can trust you in a way I can't trust anyone else in the company right now." The weight of Richard's trust sat heavily on Jack's shoulders. He knew he needed to come clean about his past, about how he'd initially kept the briefcase, but every time he worked up the courage, the moment slipped away, and his secret remained buried. As their investigation deepened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The fraud went beyond mere embezzlement. There were signs of kickbacks, bribery, and possible connections to organized crime. At the center of it all was Thomas Green, but the evidence suggested he wasn't working alone. "There has to be someone higher up involved," Richard mused one night, frustration evident in his voice. "Someone with the authority to approve these transactions without raising red flags." A chill ran down Jack's spine as he remembered Evelyn, Hartley's piercing gaze and the look that had passed between her and Green. Could it be possible? He pushed the thought aside, not wanting to voice such a damning suspicion without proof. Meanwhile, Jack's improved circumstances hadn't gone unnoticed at the community center. During one of his now infrequent visits, Sophia pulled him aside, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. "Jack, I'm so happy to see how well you're doing," she said warmly, "but I can't help feeling there's something you're not telling me. Those men who are asking questions, they've been back, and they seemed very interested in your relationship with Richard Hartley." Jack's heart raced. He wanted desperately to confide in Sophia, to share the burden of his secret and the dangerous game he now found himself playing. But he knew that the less she knew, the safer she would be. "Sophia, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You don't have to explain," she said softly. "Just know that whatever you're involved in, I'm here if you need me. Promise me you'll be careful." Jack nodded, touched by her concern and wishing, not for the first time, that circumstances were different. As he left the center, he didn't notice the dark sedan parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the watchful eyes within. Back at the construction site, tension was mounting. Jack could feel the subtle shift in atmosphere, the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, the wary glances from his co-workers. Thomas Green had become increasingly agitated, barking orders and scrutinizing every detail of the project with an almost manic intensity. One afternoon, as Jack was reviewing blueprints in a quiet corner of the site, he overheard a heated conversation between Green and another executive he didn't recognize. "We're running out of time," the stranger hissed. "Hartley's getting too close. We need to accelerate the plan." Green's response was too low to hear, but the menace in his tone was unmistakable. As the two men parted, Jack caught a glimpse of the stranger's face and felt his blood run cold. He recognized him from the documents he and Richard had been reviewing, a name connected to several of the most suspicious transactions. That night, as Jack relayed what he'd overheard to Richard, he could see the older man's face grow pale. "This is worse than I thought," Richard said, running a hand through his silver hair. "They must know we're onto them. We need to move quickly, but carefully. One wrong move and we could lose everything." As they formulated their next steps, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The pieces were there, but they weren't fitting together quite right. It was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces turned upside down. Days passed, each one ratcheting up the tension. Jack found himself jumping at shadows, second-guessing every interaction. He knew they were close to unraveling the whole scheme, but the closer they got, the more dangerous their position became. It all came to a head on a rain-soaked evening, eerily reminiscent of the night that had started it all. Jack was working late, using the quiet of the deserted construction site to go over some discrepancies he'd noticed in the latest batch of financial records. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up sharply. Thomas Green emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "I always knew there was something off about you, Reynolds," Green snarled. "Hartley's new golden boy rising up from nowhere. Did you really think you could play in our league and not get burned?" Jack stood slowly, his mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Green. I'm just doing my job." Green's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Your job?" "Oh, I think we both know you've been doing a lot more than that. The question is, how much do you actually know?" As Green advanced, Jack became acutely aware of how isolated they were. The rain drummed on the roof of the half-finished building, masking any sounds that might attract attention. "You've got it all wrong," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady as he edged towards the exit. "Whatever you think is going on—" "Shut up," Green snapped. "I'm done playing games. You're going to tell me everything you and Hartley have uncovered, and then we're going to have a little accident. It's a dangerous job site, after all. Accidents happen all the time." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the true gravity of his situation. This wasn't just about money or fraud anymore. His life was on the line. Just as Green reached for him, a voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "That's enough, Thomas." Both men turned to see Evelyn Hartley standing in the doorway, her elegant figure silhouetted against the rainy night. "Mrs. Hartley," Green stammered, clearly thrown off balance. "I was just—" "Save it!" Evelyn cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "I heard everything, and I think it's time we all had a long-overdue conversation." As Evelyn stepped fully into the light, Jack noticed something in her hand, a small recording device. The pieces suddenly clicked into place, and he realized that the puzzle they'd been trying to solve was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Evelyn turned to Jack, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Reynolds, I believe you have something that belongs to my husband. A briefcase, perhaps. I think it's time you returned it. And then, gentlemen, we're all going to sit down and discuss the future of Hartley Construction, because believe me, everything is about to change." In that moment, standing between the furious Thomas Green and the enigmatic Evelyn Hartley, Jack knew that the real storm was just beginning. The truth he'd been seeking was finally within reach, but it promised to be far more explosive and far-reaching than he could have ever anticipated. As the rain continued to fall outside, washing away the old and making way for the new, Jack steeled himself for the confrontation to come. Whatever happened next would not only determine his fate, but also the fate of everyone connected to Hartley Construction. The game had changed, and now it was time to see who would be left standing when all the cards were finally on the table. The tension in Richard Hartley's home office was palpable as Jack, Richard, Evelyn, and a visibly agitated Thomas Green sat around the imposing mahogany desk. The briefcase that had started it all lay open between them, its contents spread out like a roadmap of deceit. "I think it's time we all laid our cards on the table," Evelyn began, her voice calm but tinged with steel. "Richard, darling, why don't you start by explaining to Jack and Thomas exactly what you've been up to these past few months?" Richard cleared his throat, looking older and more tired than Jack had ever seen him. "It began about a year ago," he said slowly. "I started noticing discrepancies in our financial reports. Small things at first, easily explained away. But as I dug deeper, I realized there was a systematic fraud taking place within our company." He turned to Jack, a hint of apology in his eyes. "That night you found me, Jack, I had just confronted our CFO with evidence of his involvement. He didn't take it well. The attack wasn't random, it was an attempt to silence me." Jack's mind reeled as he processed this information. "But why didn't you go to the police?" "Because, Mr. Reynolds," Evelyn interjected, "we didn't know how far. The corruption had spread. For all we knew, local law enforcement could have been compromised as well." Thomas Green, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly burst out, "This is ridiculous. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. This is nothing but baseless accusations and conspiracy theories. Evelyn's laugh was cold and mirthless. Oh, Thomas, always so quick to deny, but I'm afraid we have all the proof we need. She produced a small USB drive from her pocket. This contains every email, every doctored financial report, every illicit transaction you've overseen for the past 3 years. Green's face paled visibly. How did you didn't think I was just a trophy wife, did you? Evelyn's smile was razor-sharp. While Richard was playing the distracted CEO, I was digging into every corner of this company, and what I found was far worse than either of us could have imagined. She turned to Jack, her expression softening slightly. That's where you came in, Mr. Reynolds. We needed someone on the inside, someone beyond suspicion. When Richard told me about the honest man who'd saved his life, I knew we'd found our ace in the hole. Jack's head spun as he tried to process everything. So all of this, my job, the investigation with Richard, it was all part of your plan. Richard reached out, placing a comforting hand on Jack's shoulder. Not at first, son. But as we got to know you, as we saw your integrity and your drive, we knew we could trust you with the truth. The truth? Thomas sputtered, his composure cracking. You want the truth? The truth is that this company was dying before I stepped in. The fraud you're so quick to condemn is the only thing that's kept Hartley Construction afloat in a cutthroat market. Evelyn's eyes flashed dangerously. Is that how you justify selling contracts to shell companies owned by organized crime? How you rationalize putting our workers at risk with subpar materials to pad your own pockets? As Green and Evelyn traded accusations, Jack's mind raced. He thought of the long nights poring over documents with Richard, the suspicious glances. At the construction site, Sophia's concerned warnings. It had all been leading to this moment. Enough! Richard's voice cut through the argument, silencing everyone. This ends now. Thomas, you have a choice to make. You can cooperate fully, help us unravel this mess and face the consequences of your actions, or you can walk out that door and take your chances with the authorities. Because make no mistake, this evidence is going to the FBI with or without your cooperation. Green's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. For a moment, Jack thought he might make a run for it, but then, like a deflating balloon, all the fight seemed to go out of him. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They'll kill me if I talk. The people involved in this, they're not the kind you can just walk away from. A heavy silence fell over the room as the true gravity of the situation sank in. This wasn't just about saving a company anymore. Lives were at stake. It was Jack who finally broke the silence. Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Hartley, I think there's something you should know. Taking a deep breath, he recounted the full story of that rainy night, his initial temptation to keep the money, his decision to help, and his subsequent struggles with the truth. As he finished, he met Richard's gaze squarely. I'm sorry I wasn't completely honest from the beginning. I understand if this changes things, if you can't trust me anymore. But I want you to know that I'm committed to seeing this through, whatever it takes. To Jack's surprise, it was Evelyn who responded first. Mr. Reynolds, your honesty now only confirms what we've believed about your character all along. We're not looking for perfect people. We're looking for those with the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Richard nodded in agreement. Jack, you've proven yourself 100 times over. We wouldn't be here on the verge of exposing this whole operation without you. Whatever happens next, you're part of this family now. The word family hit Jack like a physical force. For so long, he'd been alone, struggling just to survive. Now, he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. As the group began to formulate their plan to bring the evidence to the authorities, Jack excused himself for a moment. Stepping out onto the balcony, he took in the glittering lights of Portland spread out below. The city that had once seemed so cold and unforgiving now felt full of possibility. A soft voice interrupted his reverie. Quite a view, isn't it? Sophia Martinez stepped out to join him, her presence both surprising and comforting. Sophia? What are you doing here? She smiled, a mix of pride and concern in her eyes. Evelyn called me. She thought you might need a friendly face, someone to remind you of how far you've come. As Jack looked at Sophia, he felt a rush of emotions he couldn't quite name. In her, He saw not just a friend or a social worker, but a partner, someone who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. "Sophia, there's so much I want to tell you, so much that's happened." She took his hand, her touch grounding him in the moment. "I know, Jack, and we'll have time for all of that, but right now there are people in there who need you. You've started something important, something that could change a lot of lives for the better. Are you ready to see it through?" Jack squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. "Yeah," he said, a new determination in his voice. "Yeah, I am." As they turned to rejoin the others, Jack felt a sense of purpose, unlike anything he'd ever known. The path ahead was uncertain, possibly dangerous, but for the first time in his life he wasn't facing it alone. Inside, Richard, Evelyn, and even the subdued Thomas Green looked up as Jack and Sophia entered. There was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, as if they all stood on the brink of something monumental. "All right," Jack said, his voice steady and confident. "Let's finish this. What's our next move?" As the group huddled together, formulating their strategy to expose the truth and bring justice to those who had corrupted Hartley Construction, Jack couldn't help but marvel at the twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. From a homeless man on the streets to a key player in unraveling a complex web of corporate crime, life, it seemed, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. The night stretched on, filled with intense discussions, careful planning, and the forging of unlikely alliances. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, they had a solid plan in place. The road ahead would be challenging, but together they stood a fighting chance of setting things right. As Jack watched the sun rise over Portland, casting the city in a golden glow, he felt a surge of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The man he had been, lost, alone, and without purpose, was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone stronger, someone who had found not just a job or a cause, but a true home. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity, as Jack, the Hartleys, and their small team of trusted allies worked tirelessly to build their case. Every day brought new challenges and revelations, each more startling than the last. But the web of corruption they uncovered stretched far beyond Hartley Construction, implicating local politicians, rival companies, and even members of law enforcement. Through it all, Jack found himself growing into a role he never imagined he could fill. His street smarts, combined with his newfound knowledge of the construction industry, proved invaluable as they pieced together the complex puzzle of fraud and deceit. One crisp autumn morning, as Jack pored over a stack of documents in Richard's home office, Evelyn entered with a grim expression. "We've got a problem," she announced, her voice tense. "Thomas Green has disappeared." The news sent a chill through the room. Green, despite his initial resistance, had become a reluctant but crucial source of information. His disappearance could only mean one thing: their operation had been compromised. Richard's face paled. "Do you think he's gone to warn the others?" Evelyn shook her head. "I don't think so. My sources tell me he was seen being forced into a car late last night. I think our opponents have decided to tie up loose ends." The gravity of the situation sank in. They weren't just dealing with white-collar criminals. These were dangerous people willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests. Jack stood up, determination etched on his face. "We need to move fast. If they're onto us, we don't have much time before they come after the rest of us." As if on cue, Sophia burst into the room, her usual calm demeanor shaken. "Jack, Richard, you need to see this." She turned on the television, flipping to a local news channel. The screen showed footage of the Hartley construction site engulfed in flames. The newscaster's voice cut through the shocked silence. "In what authorities are calling a suspected case of arson. Fortunately, the site was empty at the time, but the damage is estimated to be in the millions." Richard sank into his chair, his face ashen. All those years of work, gone. Jack placed a comforting hand on the older man's shoulder. "Not gone, Mr. Hartley, just changed. This isn't the end. It's proof that we're on the right track. They're scared and they're lashing out." Evelyn nodded, a fierce glint in her eye. "Jack's right. We can rebuild buildings, but they can't escape the truth once it's out. This ends now." With renewed urgency, they put their plan into action. Jack reached out to his old contacts on the streets, gathering whispers and rumors that helped fill in the gaps in their investigation. Sophia leveraged her connections in social services to uncover a trail of exploited workers and unsafe conditions that stretched back years. As the pieces fell into place, a clear picture emerged of a vast criminal enterprise that had infiltrated every level of Portland's construction industry. At its heart were a group of powerful individuals who had treated the city as their personal playground, prioritizing profit over people at every turn. The day of reckoning arrived on a rain-soaked morning, reminiscent of the night that had started it all. Jack stood beside Richard and Evelyn as they presented their evidence to the FBI and the state attorney general. Hours of testimony and mountains of documentation laid bare the full extent of the corruption that had plagued Portland for years. As the official wheels of justice began to turn, Jack felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They had done it, the truth was out, but he knew the fight was far from over. In the days that followed, Portland was rocked by a series of high-profile arrests. Business leaders, politicians, and even a few law enforcement officials were led away in handcuffs as the full scope of the scandal came to light. The media frenzy was intense, with Jack and the Hartleys thrust into the spotlight as the whistleblowers who had brought down a criminal empire. Through it all, Jack found strength in the unlikely family he had forged. Richard and Evelyn treated him like a son, offering guidance and support as he navigated his newfound notoriety. Sophia remained a steadfast presence, her quiet strength, a balm for the moments when the pressure threatened to overwhelm him. As the dust began to settle, Jack stood with Richard on the site of the burned-out construction project. The charred remnants of their work surrounded them, a stark reminder of all they had been through. Richard surveyed the scene, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, Jack, some might look at this and see only destruction, but I see an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, not just this site, but the entire way we do business in this city." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of what Richard was proposing. It won't be easy. There are still people out there who benefited from the old way of doing things. They won't go down without a fight. "No," Richard agreed, "it won't be easy, but it will be worth it. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather have by my side for this next chapter than you, son." The word son caught Jack off guard, filling him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He realized that somewhere along this journey, he had found, more than just purpose, he had found a home. As they turned to leave the site, a familiar figure approached. Sophia walked towards them, a smile breaking through her typically serious demeanor. "I thought I might find you two here," she said. "The community center just received an interesting proposal. Seems someone wants to start a program to help people transition from homelessness into careers in ethical construction practices. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Jack felt a blush creep up his neck. He had been working on the idea for weeks, but hadn't found the courage to bring it up. "I just thought, well, if I could turn my life around, maybe others could too with the right support." Richard beamed with pride. "It's a brilliant idea, Jack. In fact, I think Hartley Construction should be the first to partner with this program. What do you say, Sophia? Think we can make it happen?" Sophia's eyes met Jack's, and he saw in them a reflection of his own hope for the future. "I think," she said softly, "that together we can make just about anything happen." As they walked, away from the construction site, Jack felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The city that had once been a place of hardship and despair now held the promise of a brighter future, not just for him, but for countless others who needed a second chance. In the months that followed, Hartley Construction rose from the ashes, reborn as a beacon of ethical business practices in Portland. Jack, with Richard's mentorship and Sophia's unwavering support, spearheaded the new transition program, helping former homeless individuals find purpose and dignity through honest work. The road wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks and challenges, moments when the weight of their ambitions seemed almost too much to bear. But with each obstacle overcome, with each life changed for the better, Jack felt his resolve strengthen. 1 year to the day after that fateful rainy night, Jack stood before a crowd gathered to celebrate the completion of Hartley Construction's first major project since the scandal. As he prepared to cut the ribbon, he caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. Richard and Evelyn beaming with parental pride, Sophia watching with quiet joy, and scattered throughout, the faces of those whose lives had been transformed by their collective efforts. Jack's voice rang out clear and strong, filled with the confidence of a man who had found his true calling. This building stands as more than just steel and concrete. It's a monument to second chances, to the power of community, and to the unbreakable spirit of Portland. Today, we're not just opening a building. We're opening the door to a future where everyone has the opportunity to build a better life. As applause erupted and the ribbon fell away, Jack felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The journey that had begun on a rain-soaked street corner had led him here, to a place of purpose, family, and hope. And as he looked out at the city skyline, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. The best chapters of his story, and the stories of countless others, were yet to be written. In that moment, standing amid the fruits of their labor and surrounded by the family he had found, Jack Reynolds realized that sometimes the greatest adventures in life begin with a simple act of kindness, and in a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving, that knowledge shone like a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome, to grow, and to build a brighter future for all.